So, lovely to see so many of you here. So this talk is, well, I've been going through different titles, but this is the most simple way I can put it. Keep Umbraco simple. But then again, that's not realistic because, as you know, you can use Umbraco for many different things. So at some point you'll hit something that's not so simple, and you're kind of forced into the route of using a more complex solution. So it's keep Umbraco simple for as long as possible, or keep Umbraco simple, or I'll break your arm. My name is Ploug. You can pronounce that any way you want. I've been through a lot of those. So Pierre is fine, Per is fine, Pierre is fine. You don't have to mention my last name, that's also good. The lady at Starbucks calls me Brian. So whatever works for you, that's fine. I am the product owner of Umbraco CMS. You can reach me at that email. You can reach me there on Twitter. For recruiters, I'm also Brian on LinkedIn, so just go ahead. So, we're close to shortage, so I would like to talk about peak hipster for a moment. So, I heard this expression a couple years ago, peak hipster, and there was something like this. It was like peak hipster. And this is not peak hipster at all anymore. This is like an accountant by today's standards. So it moves, it changes over time. Peak hipster is not peak hipster at all anymore. Maybe it's this guy here. This is Matt Brailsford, by the way. So again, it moves, it evolves, it gets more and more hipster. And then someone got a peacock as a pet. This is from Brooklyn. So peak hipster always keeps on peaking. There's no upper limit of how hipster you can be. And then you have another expression. Oh, sorry, we also have mustaches with mustaches on. Anyways, we have peak Umbraco, which was called by Ishmael, who works at Cogworks. We were talking about conference sessions, and he said, well, a couple years ago, we thought we hit peak Umbraco. And in that, we mean peak Umbraco in, you take Umbraco, and then you make a session combining it with something very complicated. So that's, how do we use Umbraco with continuous integration, or with this, or a mapper, or this very complicated test suite, or how do we use Umbraco with BDD and so on. All those things are fine. It's not that, not at all. There's nothing wrong with the topics. That's fine. The problem is that when you sit at these conferences and you hear all these very complicated talks about how you should set up your environment, how you should work, how many different services and so on you should use. Should you use microservices all of a sudden? Should you use REST? Should you go back and be retro and use SOAP? Who knows? But if you only hear about the complicated things at conferences, you also go back to your own little world and say, maybe I'm not complicated enough. And that's where this whole idea of cargo called science comes in. How many knows what this is? So a couple of you. So this was a theory by Richard Feynman, who looked at these primitive tribes, and especially primitive tribes who'd been in touch with Western technology. So they'd seen an airplane, or they'd seen a pair of glasses or a Walkman, and then they copied it as a kind of a religion. So they built a plane out of bamboo, and then they thought as a religious thing that this plane could bring them the same goods as a real plane. So they took something that they didn't really understood, and then they copied it into their own world in the hope that it would give them the same thing. So that's cargo called science. That you take something from outside your world, you take it into your own without actually considering the context, and considering if it actually makes sense for you to put into your own world. And again, there's nothing wrong with all those advanced topics, it's just consider where you use them. Consider your own world, consider the context of what you're building. Because it has a tendency to look really nice when you look at all those layers of complexity. Presented well, everything can look really nice and appealing, and there's a lot of reasons to do complicated things. But if you just take it back and copy it, then you can end up with something like this. And then it's not so nice. And the problem is, complexity has a tendency to stick around. So when you all of a sudden have introduced this very complicated step in your workflow, you don't really take it out again, because what would happen if we don't have this very precious piece of technology anymore? So it's very hard to change complicated things again. So that's why they stick around. So maybe you should just have made a muffin instead. So why is it a problem with this complexity? It takes time to actually figure out complex solutions. It takes time to figure out a very complicated Umbraco site. It takes time to figure out where this piece of content gets its view from. This view consists of partials or macros, or it calls an action from a controller. This controller uses dependency injection. We have something else in there, and so on and so on. Again, it might be fine, but did you introduce it too early? Was there actually a reason to do it? Or are you just doing it because you're following a pattern, for instance? It takes time for people who don't know your workflow. And it can also look like this for new people. It's like, again, connecting the wires, where do everything go? If it doesn't follow the standard way of building an Umbraco site, then the person taking over from you or inheriting your project will end up looking at it like, I have no idea what this is. I don't know, if I poke this thing, it breaks over here, and I have no idea. So you might have had the best intentions of following some well-established pattern, but it just doesn't fit in the context of the site that you're building. So there's nothing wrong with complex solutions, which we'll also go through here, but keep away from them for as long as possible. It also ended up making people angry is probably a better word. As we run, he's very articulate about how much he hates Umbraco. It's like a burning fire of hate. When we see these sites, when people say this on Twitter, we usually ask them, hey, could we see your site? Because we can understand that there's differences between Umbraco sites. And when we see these sites, I can sometimes understand why they hate them so much. Because we've seen sites where there's been 30 pages in the site itself. Those 30 pages used 30 document types. And each document type had the same set of 42 fields, and they were all text areas. And I don't know how people got to that point where they thought that was a good idea. But just the point is, because there's no set way of building an Umbraco site, you can end up with all these different solutions, and no Umbraco site is like the other one. It never looks the same. And another one. She's from London, so she might be here. Are you here? Okay. Anyways, so what is the problem? Why does this happen? The problem is that this is basically how we think Umbraco. We think Umbraco as a set of very simple bits and pieces you can put together, and then you get a website. The problem is you can also use these bits and pieces wrong. So you can put something together in a completely different way that was not thought of at all. And this usually don't happen intentionally. There's no one who sets out on a journey to build something that's horrible. No one does that. It's just, maybe you ended up painting yourself into a corner. Maybe you made some decisions in the beginning. Then all of a sudden you had a site that was very complicated because you needed to add on things as the client changed their mind. So what we're going to do now is going to build a basic website with a bit of custom code, because it's unrealistically to just build a hello world site that will only cover 50% of what most people do with Umbraco. But we'll try to cover getting up and running with Umbraco as simple as possible. We'll talk about scaffolding, which is basically a whole process that you go through building document types, picking the right document type, picking the right structure, permissions, and so on. And this is probably the most important step in the life cycle of your site, is all the stuff that you do in regards to document types. Then we'll do a bit of feature iterations. How can we build on top of the scaffold we built with the document types? We'll talk a bit about design, how we do templating, macros, partials, and so on. We'll do a couple of integration tasks in the sense that we're integrating some code from outside of our website, getting it into Umbraco, getting it into our website, and seeing it on the page itself, and how we can do that. And I couldn't really find a nice word for this. This is wrap complexity in simple. But in the end, you will do something that probably requires you to perform a complex action that requires a lot of moving parts. But then it's also our job to actually try to wrap all this complexity in something that is simple to the end user. That should always be the goal. So as you can see, this is not at all rocket science. So if you've been using Umbraco for more than a year, then you probably know all this. So you can of course go now. So I'll take a sip of water, and then if you want to go see the other thing, then it's perfectly fine. No one? Okay. Well, let's go on then. So let's try to get Umbraco set up. And the reason why I'm doing it this way, using Umbraco as a service, is because this is absolutely the most simple way to set up an Umbraco website. The second simplest way is to download the zip file and run it inside of WebMatrix or Visual Studio Code or using IIS Express. That's the second simplest one. But the absolute simplest one is just clicking a button on a service. So that's what I'm going to do. You have all the other options. And the good thing about this is that you're free to leave whenever you want. So you just pull it down, you have the site on your machine, and then you're practically back to if you had downloaded a zip. So let's give this a name. UK Fest. Mistaken, so I'll take this one so Nils can't use it. So the point of this, that I'm doing it this way, is that I don't have to think about permissions or databases or web servers or anything else. I can just have a site that I can start building on because I don't really need anything else to actually start building my site. I don't need to do the whole ceremony of setting up Visual Studio, making the choice with NuGet packages and so on. I actually just want a back office that I can log into and start planning my site. That is, to me, the very first and simple step you can do. And it's also the step that has that carries the greatest risk. This is where you can make most of the wrong choices. So let's see if we can log in. There we go. So we have an Umbraco installation up and running, and now I can start working on my site. And it's just, you can do it all the other ways. It's fine. But if you think of what is the simplest way of getting to the point where I can start sketching out my site, then this is the way. So let's go back to the slides again. And just for those who are kind of worried, is this just an Umbraco Cloud presentation? No, it's not. This is just an example. We'll not stick with this, don't worry. So a couple of points. No need to jump into Visual Studio from day one. It's always possible to move Umbraco to Visual Studio later. It's just a website. It's not a huge project. You can always drag it into Visual Studio when you need it. You don't need to do it on day one. And the point is just to keep Visual Studio away from the project as long as possible. First of all, if you start using Visual Studio, then you require everyone in your organization to actually use and learn this tool as well. That might not make sense to everybody. And also you don't need to fiddle with NuGet and so on. So, and from Umbraco Cloud, there's actually even tooling for moving it to Visual Studio and getting away from the service. I'll show you that later. So, scaffolding or making a blueprint or creating the basic structure of your site. So let's go back to the site I created. So we'll move into settings and open up the document types. And this is where the first thoughts about your site should start appearing. You probably sketch it out on paper, you probably have a feature set from a client and so on. But I prefer to actually divide it into two. So the process is, you think about what kind of types of pages you want. So we'll build up a structure of pages. So we need a home page. It always needs to have the house as an icon. I won't add any fields to it because it's too early in the process. I have no idea what the client actually wants on the front page, and that is bound to change anyways later on, and I can always add them. So keep them away from now. Then I definitely need the mandatory text page, which everybody has, and is used way too much. That should be orange. There we go. And I know they need news, so we'll make a news area. We're planning on having a workshop at Future Code Gardens about just the art of picking the right icon. And we need an article for that news area as well. So that's my very basic structure. And we'll make that green as well. There we go. Then I need to figure out my permission model, and it's very easy now that I only have these things to actually work with. So I need that my homepage is the thing that will be in the root of my site, and I need that under my homepage I know that I will be able to create text pages and news areas. And I need that on my news area I can create articles. So there we go. All that we need. So what I can do now is I can take this, a very basic scaffold of my site, and use that to start building out a prototype, which we can then start building the design on later on. So we'll make a community site. Whoop. Yeah. And we'll add in a text page that says contact us. We'll probably have something about, we'll have some news. And we'll have some meetups. So the point is we're getting to this structure as simple as possible. We don't need to think a lot about the actual content or the types of content, because these will change later on. Usually they will actually change when we actually figure out what the client actually wants to put in there. And we likely don't know that based on a spec. We likely know that when we actually show the site to the client and involve them in the process and saying, what do you actually need here? And what turns out that we thought would be a date picker is actually better as a integer field, because they actually need to put things before 1753, which doesn't work with actually date times. All these little nuances of a site, you will only realize that when you actually talk to the person who's going to use it. So there's no reason to think about this already. Make it as simple as possible so you don't paint yourself into a corner. So that's the very basic structure. And the good thing about keeping this structure as simple as possible is that you can then start iterating over features and just attach them as you want. So you can start adding features to your documents as you need them. So a very basic example of this is saying that with these document types now, there's a couple of things that's no-brainers that I know will be like this no matter what the client will do later on. So I'll do those first. Is that the text page will probably have a content tab, and that content tab will likely have a body text, which is a rich text editor. I also know that they will likely have articles that they want in several columns and so on, so they will also have an article tab, and that article is very likely to be a grid. I won't actually make any choices in regards to the grid line now again, because that's too soon. We need to know more about the project to actually do that. So again, keeping it simple, these are the only two fields I actually need right away. So the good thing about keeping your basic scaffold simple is that you can now add in things in chunks or as in components. For those who've been using Umbraco for a longer time, is that you know that you can actually right-click a document type, and then you can create a child of that document type. And then you can inherit a bunch of fields. So you can build up these very elaborate structures, inheriting fields based on a base document type, which inherits, and the text page inherits that, and the two-column text page inherits from that, and so on. But you should not do that. You should not use inheritance, because you are bound to paint yourself into a corner. The only way you, in any possible way, can use inheritance is if you know the entire structure and the entire setup of content at the beginning, which you won't. That will be the new waterfall model, that you have a spec, then you have the document type guy, and then you have design waiting for the document type guy, and then you have the content. And you don't want to get into that situation. You want to have as fluid as possible a process where you can start adding in features as you like to. So the different way of doing it is by using document types as components. So instead of creating an inheritance model, I'll create a composition model instead. So by clicking document types, I'll create a folder. Don't need to do this, but it's nice to know the difference between the types. And in this folder, I'll start adding document types without a template, because I'll only use these to be add-on fields to different types. So in here, I'll make a metadata document type. In this case, I want to add the functionality of adding these search engine optimization fields on a document type. So we'll call the tab metadata. And we'll have an abstract. That'll be in the text area. Maybe we have a title. That'll be a text field or text string. And we'll have some keywords. Maybe it's just a text area, maybe it's a tag thing. We don't know yet. We'll go with the tags. So this place I can keep on adding and adding and adding. What's important here is that I've isolated this piece of functionality inside of a document type, which I can then attach to the other document types as I need to, so I can make a composition instead of an inheritance. So I need these search engine fields, I need those on my text pages. So I click the little composition button up here, and I just check in the metadata field here, and there we go. Then you see you have the little metadata tab up here, but you can also see that the sorting order is all wrong. So what you can do about this is, if you click reorder, then you're not allowed to move this one because it's actually composited into the type. What you can do instead is you can override these different sort orders by actually going to the inherited type or the composite type, and you can set in a index here, just completely manual, say this should be at index 10 and save this. It's a hack, but it works. So now let's move down here, and then you can start ordering your different compositions into what order you want them to. So if you want to have it at the very end, you can put in sort order 666 if you want to. So this means that we've added a bit of functionality to our text pages in a separate tab, and we are automatically dividing these things into these tabs based on the functionality. And we can also go remove them again. And we don't have this huge inheritance model to actually deal with. We can just check or uncheck functionality as we need it, which is very powerful because if you use a iterative process like Scrum, you can say in this sprint we'll add in this search engine optimization functionality, and at the end we can check off all the boxes on which document type should support this functionality, and then we're done. Then when we change our mind, we can just uncheck the box, it'll go away for those specific types, and everything is left completely as it was. So let's go over this, if I forgot anything. So don't build the entire thing at once. Very important, you don't know what everything will be. Rather go along building it as you find out what it actually is you need. You can build up the basic structure and figure out what is the basic idea of the site, but you won't know all the answers at the beginning. So in order to avoid inheritance, you are bound to build yourself or dig yourself into a corner, paint yourself into a corner. Instead, use compositions. Focus on the structure of a site in the beginning, and then later on its content. The other thing gets too close into being a waterfall model. You make too many decisions at the beginning, which you have to live with for a very long time. Templates and design. This is the easiest one, because I'm just going to copy-paste things in. So, where are our sites? So here are our document types. We'll close that one, and then we have the templates. So usually what I do here is I make a single master template, and I've rarely seen that you have to have more levels than that. When you get into 3 or 4 levels of template inheritance, you get into the same problems as you do with document type inheritance. That you get this huge graph of HTML that's mixed together, and it's very hard to kind of work with at some point. It's nice in the beginning that you have no code that's repeated, you're staying dry. That is fine, but you also build up a structure that's very hard to break out of again. And at some point when you later on need to add an additional change, then you'll break out of it again and copy paste some code. It's very hard to avoid. And if you're trying to build up the entire structure with inheritance or multiple levels of this, then you'll get into this very advanced structure. So I always try my hardest to keep it at a single master template, and that's the single source of all my surrounding HTML, and then I have a single level of templates below it. Oop. If I could spell, there we go. So let's just set up the structure of these templates. So let's make this a master here, and we'll do this. There we go. And then we need some HTML. And Umbraco is not a design tool, so we'll just keep it at we're just copy pasting, and that will solve our problem for now. So let's find some HTML. We have some here. So this is the homepage. We have the master. And we have a text page, I think. And then we are pretty almost set, I think. There we go. So already pre-populated it with a bit of code. So we have the model content.name up here. We have model content body text down here. And on the article that's using the grid, we have HTML, get grid HTML from the body text. That's kind of the only thing that's really non-HTML in here. But the point of building up the template at this point is just to give it a basic idea of how the site will look and work without actually putting too much effort into it. So we'll need to build up some navigation, because if you go and look at the site now, we need one more thing, you can probably guess, which is CSS. So we'll add that as well. And we should have some CSS over here to copy. There we go. And there we go. So much better. So this is the HTML of a coming starter kit, which we'll probably see soon. But up here we need to have some sort of navigation, and the reason why we actually need to do this at this point is that we want to start navigating the site. We want to see how this structure will actually work. We need to figure out if the basic stuff we built is too basic or doesn't work with the things we have planned for this design. So let's go in and build a basic navigation. And there's multiple ways of adding this functionality into your templates. At this stage of the project, you'll be thinking to yourself, should I do the navigation as a macro? Should I do it as a partial? Maybe I need to do it as a HTML action. But in this case, for just adding in a piece of navigation that will only be used once, you should go for the absolutely simplest approach, which is just putting the code in line of your template. Just render it in here. It makes no sense to use a partial. It just hides away where the code actually is. It makes it harder to read, and people have to kind of figure out where in your structure this partial is. A macro, it makes sense when you want to give editors access to code that you've written, for instance, for inserting it into a grid or rich text editor, but doesn't make sense to add that complexity in your templates at this point. You might have good reason to do it later on, but right now in this stage here, you should stay as simple as possible and just add it as an inline thing. So we have a navigation piece here, which is the mobile version of the navigation, and then we have the actual navigation down here, so we need to replace both of them. If you don't know, if you're new to Umbraco, there's a little tool up here, there's a query builder, which helps you decide where to actually pull things in. So in this case here, I want everything from my website, and I'll just like to order it like this. So this gives me a piece of code that I can use. So I can insert that like this, and it'll render a bit of a eraser down here. So the selection is here. It has a for each loop. We'll modify this for each loop into actually being the navigation. And copy this one here. There we go. And we of course need to have the URL of the page. That's item.url. And item.name. Like this. And we can actually reuse this down further on this piece of navigation down here. There we go. Okay, so let's see if this actually works. So now we get the navigation that actually reflects the structure we are building up very simply. So again, the point is here to stay as simple as possible. Actually, adding in the complexity of a partial or a macro or rendering a HTML action is overkill for stuff like this. This is 3 lines of code. You're repeating it 2 times, but again, it makes no sense that you have to decipher a partial at this stage here, and you have to find the partial and then figure out where it's used. That makes no sense at all. So that's the very basic navigation, and the end result is a site that sort of works. We can navigate it around, and we can start doing other things with it. And then we can also break it, apparently. We'll figure that out later. So let's go back to the slides. That hopefully doesn't break. So consider your levels of template inheritance. Why do you actually need 3 levels? You probably don't. Keep it simple. Don't be afraid that you actually have code that's repeated in multiple places. Keep it under control, but in many cases, a use of partial because you use a snippet of HTML 2 places is never a good argument. It's better that you actually have very readable, simple templates the way people can actually see what's going on. There's a lot of good reasons to add in inline razor when you want to stay simple. Use partials when you have components or very large chunks of HTML or layout that will just disturb the entire design when you're actually trying to figure out what the design is about. If you have huge chunks of stuff that just needs to be put away, then encapsulate it in a partial, that's perfectly fine. Macros, use them when it makes sense, and it usually makes sense when you want to give editors or non-technical users access to code that you've written, which they can then insert into rich text areas or grids where they can add in parameters to your code. Then it makes sense. HTML actions, when you're building forms, or you need to pre-populate with your code, but again, in this stage here, it's probably overkill. Also, consider all these things. Are you using them because it's a pattern or because it is the simplest possible way of doing it? You can always change it later on. So let's move on to something a bit more advanced, which is doing an integration with an external data source and doing a custom editor for that. So for this side here, what I actually want to do is that every time I write a piece of news, an article, I can start writing in the grid. I can start building that up slowly as I want to. That's not the point here. But I would like to add the functionality that this article actually about a bunch of community projects. I would like that I have links to our, where I can then show the different projects. So you can read the article, and then you have this list of projects that's related to this piece of content. So I need some sort of integration with our. And if we do the simplest possible approach to this, we go in and we make a new component, which should not be with the template. There we go. And we call this projects. And in here, I'll have a featured projects field. And if I just want to do this in the simplest way, I'll do the related links picker. So I can just find a link on our Umbraco, I can put it into the list here, give it a name, and then I can list it out. So if we try to do that and consider what actually happens to the user when we do that. So let's say that I want to write a new article. It should be about nested content versus, I don't know, Nils. And oh, we forgot something. We'll just save this and go back again. We forgot to add in the functionality for projects because this is not actually in here right now. So what we'll do is we'll go back, and on the article we'll enable the project's composition here, add in the piece of functionality. Oh, and also make sure that this thing here is moved to the bottom, so we'll just go in and change that. I do this because projects is usually a secondary action for an editor. Their primary focus when they go in and create a new thing is to actually write the content of the article. So I want to have this as far away, out of their way as possibly can. Again, to also keep it simple for them. Our end goal should always be that we keep it simple for the end user. It might be complex for us, but it should always be simple for them. So in here, we now have the solution, the simplest possible solution to this problem that I want to link to projects on our. So I'm mentioning nested content. So I need a link to nested content. So the workflow for that would be to go to our umbraco.org, wait a moment, and search for nested content, find the package, and then we can copy the URL, and we go in here and we write a caption, nested content, and then we add it like that, okay? And then we can write some code in our templates that will list out this data. And this is a simple solution for us, but doesn't actually represent a simple solution to the editor. So in this case here, we should actually start considering maybe we should put in a bit more work in this, because this workflow will not be simple for the user. It is simple for us, and it's nice for a prototype, but the end result is not simple. So instead, we'll start writing some custom code. Because for the exact functionality of taking projects from our, pulling it into the back office in some sort of UI, there's not a package for that. So we can't just pull things off the shelf for this specific task. So we need to write something ourselves. So to do this, I could use Visual Studio Code, or I can also go with Visual Studio. And the reality of most of your jobs is probably that you do this in Visual Studio. So let's do that. So we have this little tool for Umbraco Cloud, where we can pull down this website and turn it into a Visual Studio project. So that's what we're going to do. So we're going to put it down on our local machine. And let me just find it. Where's my GitHub folder? There we go, this one. So this little command thing here is something you can download from the Umbraco Cloud documentation. And it's just a simple script. It'll download a executable. So if you have any sort of antivirus on, they'll probably go off and tell you that you're doing something really dangerous. But what you have here is a application that'll ask you for the clone URL of your Umbraco Cloud site. So we'll find that over here. And then put it in here. Then it needs a namespace. Because we're creating a project, we need to have some sort of namespace. So we'll put in UK Fest. And then it's cloning this. So it needs my credentials. Like this. And it'll clone everything. And it'll build up a project. And then this takes a bit of time. So I've already prepared that a bit. So I got this over here. This one. So this will be the end result. You have a solution file. You have a ukfest.web, which is the website itself, pulled down. Then you have a ukfest.core, which is all our custom code. And then you can see there's also a packages folder, which contains all the NuGet packages. So this tool also connects all the different NuGet packages you actually need for your website. So when you get to this point here, you start up the site for the first time. It will actually start up a restore process that restores your entire structure. It'll pull down all your already existing content from Umbraco Cloud, and then you have the same site on your machine. And then you can practically do anything with it. So in here, we have the solution. And now we moved into, we are starting to, oh, I need to get off this apparently. So in here we have taken our simple approach, and now we've gone a step further up the complexity ladder because we need it. Now we need it, so now we can do it. We stayed away from this as long as possible, but it's not until this moment that we actually needed it. So now we got this project in here. So to solve our problem now, I'll create a new property editor. And I already made that, so you don't have to see me type. But what it is, it's a simple package manifest. It contains a editor with a bit of code and a controller to perform a search. So the most important parts in here is that we use Angular $HTTP to get a URL from our here to actually search for projects, and then we populate the UI with it. The other interesting part of this is that we have a editor which uses a bit of HTML in here, and then we want to use a dialog overlay, so we actually use one of the components from the back office, which is UMB overlay. This is in the documentation as well, actually, where you can create these overlays that matches with the back office design. So I won't go into this much further because there's a whole workshop about this. But if we start up the site now, there we go. So it's the same site. Oh, it's an exact copy of the site I did before, but we log in. We have the site here, and then we can go in and look at that project's component I did before. So instead of my related links property editor here, I'll remove that because that was apparently not a very good solution. And then I'll add in a different one instead, and we will call this the same, actually, featured projects with add an editor. Where is it? Where are you? You are not here. I know why. So in my eagerness of getting the site up and running, I actually did not take the actual editor and copy it in here. So I actually need to move it into here. There we go. It needs to be in the actual site to actually work. Then I'll just touch the web config to ensure that it restarts, so it actually picks up the editor. Give it a moment. There we go. Let's try again. So delete this, add a new one, featured projects, add an editor, search for projects. There we go. So our projects picker is the one that I made. There we go. I want to save this. So I built a custom UI for this. It didn't require a lot of code. It's a controller which is roughly 25 lines of JavaScript, and there's maybe 20 lines of HTML to do this. So I don't see this as an enormous maintenance task going forward. But it gives me a simple way of doing that nested content article. In that I now have this UI instead, so I can say featured projects. I can hit the little plus sign. I get hit by the screen size problem, but we'll search for nested content. And then you get the UI for this like that. Blast. That was totally on purpose because we go in here again. Where is it? Yes. And if I go just change my, I need that file. Oh, I got two ones. So we'll just find it in here, our projects. We have the editor. And you can see here it's set to center. We'll just set it to right. Problem solved. And just clear the cache so we don't end up looking at the same template again and again. Oh, damn it. It was so close. It was so close. But I'm running out of time. So if I actually had the ability to write code that worked on smaller monitors, then that would be perfect. But let's just bask in the glory of searching for stuff on our that we can then include. The point was you can pick these, and it gives the editor a much better experience than our initial simple approach. So we spent some time, we added some complexity to our project, but the end result is simpler for the end user. And the point here is, it's actually the end user who's going to spend way more hours on this than you will, ever. They'll spend hundreds of hours using that URL picker than you actually spend implementing it. So there's nothing wrong with complexity, it's also the point of this. But use it to actually create simplicity. A very good example of that is the models builder. So the models builder source code in itself is very complex. It uses Roslyn, it compiles into runtime. Very complicated piece of technology. But the end result is a simpler syntax in our templates. We can do all these wonderful things with value converters, which I unfortunately don't have time to show you. But it's an example of a complex code that actually makes it simple for the end user. And that should always be the goal for our projects. So let's go back and take the last of the slides. Not very many, I promise. So, first point, consider off-the-shelf versus homemade. There's a lot of goodness out there. There's nested content, there's archetype, there's Vorto, all sorts of things that will solve problems for you. But sometimes homemade code is better because it's made for that single specific purpose. You might never ever use it again, but it gives you a better experience as a user, and that matters a lot. Consider editorception. Someone said yesterday, it's wonderful with all these editors now, with nested content and document type grid editor. We can build anything, and that is true. But you might also build so many layers on top of that, that in the end you have a poor user experience. Maybe you should just have put in the effort of building a custom component instead. Again, there's nothing wrong with this, but consider the situation. So a complex solution might result in a simpler result. Always remember that. Always do what is simpler for the end user, not for the developer. Again, Models Builder is complex, but it helps us wrap things in simple. So it appears simpler for the end user. It appears that our template syntax is simpler to work with, even though the complexity involved in actually making that is higher. So, final points. Consider your abstractions. Why did you even add them? Were they just there when you started a project, or did you actually add them because you had a need for them? It's easier to change simple solutions than complex ones. So start simple, you can always roll it back. Much easier than building up that entire complex solution, which you won't have a possibility to change later on. Complexity have a tendency to stick around. So if you added all this stuff to a project, are you actually ever going to need to use it at all? There's a big difference between building a website with thousands and thousands of pages and doing your mom's website. It's two different situations, and these two different situations call for different pieces of tooling. But if you build up that stack of complexity you just pull off the shelf every time, then you might actually be making it harder on yourself than you actually need to. Umbraco is a very simple thing at its core, but you can, of course, make it very complex. And think of your replacement. I know this is very grim, but someone will take over from you at some point. You might be hit by a bus, or figure out that you're better at gardening than coding. So someone will take over your code, and then you have to think about their experience with it. Will they cry, or will they be you forever grateful? So, thank you.